On the morning of June 19, 1944, a Japanese carrier pilot named Zenji Abe strapped into his aircraft above the Philippine Sea, part of a strike force his commanders believed could still turn the tide of the Pacific War. Abe was a veteran of Pearl Harbor, one of the few aviators left in the Japanese Navy who had been flying combat missions since the war's opening hours. What he flew into that morning was not the war he remembered. American fighters seemed to appear from every direction at once, flying with a speed, a coordination, and a sheer numerical advantage that made the once feared Mitsubishi Zero feel, for the first time in the war, like the slower and more vulnerable aircraft. By the end of that single day, American pilots would shoot down so many Japanese aircraft that their own radio chatter, recorded by nearby ships, would give the battle a nickname that stuck for the rest of history: the Marianas Turkey Shoot. This is the story of how the airplane that had terrified American pilots for 2.5 years lost its edge almost overnight, and how the men who once flew the most feared fighter in the Pacific found themselves, on one clear June morning, with no good answer for what was happening to them. To understand what changed by the summer of 1944, you have to understand just how dominant the Mitsubishi A6M Zero had been in the war's opening year, and why. Japanese aircraft designers, led by engineer Jiro Horikoshi, had built the Zero around a single, uncompromising philosophy: strip away everything that added weight, and build a fighter so light and so maneuverable that it could outturn anything in the sky. The Zero had no armor plating behind the pilot's seat. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks, the rubberized linings that allowed American aircraft to absorb bullet strikes without immediately catching fire. What it had instead was extraordinary range, astonishing climb performance, and a turning radius that, in the hands of a skilled pilot, made it nearly impossible for early war American fighters like the Wildcat to win a close, turning dogfight. For the first year of the Pacific War, the Zero's reputation bordered on the mythical. American pilots were briefed, sometimes with real fear in the ready room, never to try to outturn a Zero in a dogfight, because doing so was close to a death sentence. The men flying those Zeros in those opening months were, in most cases, among the most extensively trained aviators in the world. Pre-war Japanese naval air training was brutally selective and years-long, producing pilots with hundreds, sometimes well over 1,000 hours of flight time before they ever saw combat. Men who had trained together for years and flown as tight, practiced formations since long before Pearl Harbor. It was this combination, an excellent airframe and an elite, deeply experienced pilot corps, that made the Zero the most feared aircraft in the Pacific through the end of 1942. American combat reports from those first months of the war read almost like a catalog of frustration. Wildcat pilots flying off the early carriers described watching Zeros climb away from them at angles their own aircraft simply could not match, then reverse direction and come back around onto their tail before the American pilot could complete a single defensive turn. Marine aviators defending Guadalcanal's airfield in the second half of 1942, flying Wildcats that were, by any honest engineering comparison, simply outclassed in a turning fight, survived largely through discipline, teamwork, and tactics like thatch weave, rather than any advantage in the airplane itself. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces of the entire war, later wrote candidly about how thoroughly the Zero dominated the skies in those early months, describing American pilots as brave but consistently outflown, forced into defensive maneuvers that bought them survival rather than victory. It is worth sitting with how total that early dominance was, because it makes what happened 2 years later, in the skies over the Marianas, all the more striking a reversal. Jiro Horikoshi himself, the engineer behind the Zero, was reportedly never entirely comfortable with how far the Japanese Navy pushed the weight-saving philosophy behind his design. He had wanted a fighter that could outmaneuver anything else in the sky, and he got one, but the specification handed to him by naval planners demanded a combination of range, speed, and agility that, given the engine technology available to Japan at the time, could only be achieved by cutting the aircraft down to the barest possible structure. Every pound of armor plate removed, every ounce of protective rubber lining stripped from the fuel tanks, bought a little more of the performance the Navy wanted. It was an elegant engineering solution to the specification as written, and a dangerous one for the men who would eventually fly it against opponents willing and able to shoot back with heavier guns. The turning point in understanding the Zero, ironically, did not come from a battle at all. It came from a single wrecked aircraft found sitting almost intact in a marshy field on a remote island in the Aleutians. During Japan's diversionary operation against the Aleutian Islands in June of 1942, timed to coincide with the Midway operation, a Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga suffered damage to his Zero's fuel system during a raid and attempted an emergency landing on what he believed was solid ground on Akutan Island. It was, in fact, boggy tundra. The aircraft flipped onto its back on landing, killing Koga instantly, but leaving the Zero itself remarkably intact, upside down in the mud. American forces did not find the wreck for more than a month, and when a Navy salvage team finally located it, they realized almost immediately what they were looking at. A nearly complete, repairable example of the aircraft that had been terrorizing American pilots across the Pacific, delivered to them almost by accident. The recovery itself was not simple. The Zero sat upside down in soft, waterlogged tundra, its canopy crushed into the mud, and the salvage crew had to work carefully to right the aircraft and assess just how much of it had survived the crash intact. What they found, once the wreck was turned over, astonished them. Aside from the damage caused by the crash landing itself, the airframe, engine, and control surfaces were almost entirely undamaged, a nearly complete, flyable example of Japan's most closely guarded fighter design, sitting in American hands less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The wreck, which came to be known informally as the Akutan Zero, was shipped south to Naval Air Station North Island, near San Diego, painstakingly repaired over several weeks by Navy technicians, working from photographs and careful measurement, rather than any manufacturer's blueprint, and flown in a series of extensive test flights against every American fighter type available, from the Wildcat, then in frontline service, to prototypes of aircraft still under development. For the first time, American engineers and test pilots could measure, in precise and methodical detail, exactly where the Zero excelled and exactly where it was vulnerable, rather than relying on the fragmentary, often contradictory impressions pilots had brought back from combat. What they found reshaped American fighter tactics for the rest of the war. The Zero's spectacular turning ability and climb rate came at a direct cost. It could not dive particularly fast without risking structural failure. Its ailerons became sluggish and unresponsive at high speed, and because it had no armor or self-sealing tanks, a solid, well-aimed burst of gunfire, in the right place, could destroy it in a way that a heavier, better protected American fighter could often survive. Test pilots at San Diego developed a simple, almost blunt set of instructions for any American pilot who found himself facing a Zero. Never try to turn with it, but use superior diving speed, energy, and heavier firepower to strike and disengage before the Zero's advantages could come into play. This approach had already been discovered independently, months earlier and without the benefit of a captured aircraft, by a Navy pilot named John Thatch, whose Thatch weave tactic allowed slower Wildcats to survive against Zeros through coordinated mutual defense rather than raw performance. But the Akutan Zero turned a clever workaround into hard engineering data, and that data went directly into the design of the aircraft that would replace the Wildcat entirely, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Grumman had actually begun preliminary design work on the Hellcat before Pearl Harbor, but the captured Zero's test data arrived just in time to shape the aircraft's final specifications in ways that mattered enormously. Engineers reportedly adjusted elements of the Hellcat's design specifically in response to what the San Diego tests revealed, reinforcing the philosophy that speed, protection, and raw diving performance mattered more than outturning an opponent who had built an entire fighter around exactly that one strength. The Hellcat was, by design, almost the philosophical opposite of the Zero. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for agility, the Hellcat was built around a massive 2,000 horsepower engine, more than double the power of the Zeros, wrapped in a heavily armored airframe with self-sealing fuel tanks and 6 powerful 50-caliber machine guns. It was not designed to outturn a Zero. It was designed to outclimb it, outdive it, absorb hits that would have destroyed a Zero outright, and overwhelm it with raw firepower once American pilots stopped trying to dogfight on the Zero's terms and started fighting on their own. The first production Hellcats reached the fleet in the second half of 1943, and pilots transitioning from the Wildcat consistently described the difference in almost the same terms. An aircraft that felt less delicate, more forgiving of a rough landing on a pitching carrier deck, and reassuringly solid in a fight where a Wildcat pilot might have had to break off and run. Navy leadership paired the new aircraft with an equally important change: an overhauled, dramatically expanded pilot training pipeline. While Japan's training programs, strained by years of attrition and a shrinking pool of aviation fuel, were forced to shorten training hours and rush increasingly inexperienced pilots into frontline squadrons, the United States Navy was doing the exact opposite. American flight schools, backed by a fuel supply Japan could no longer match, were producing pilots in numbers that dwarfed anything Japan could sustain, and crucially, those new pilots were being trained specifically in the energy tactics the Aleutian Zero tests had validated: dive, strike, extend, and never turn with a Zero. Training syllabi were rewritten around this single, simple rule, drilled into new aviators long before they ever saw a Japanese aircraft in the air. By the spring of 1944, the gap between the two air forces had become a chasm, though few on the Japanese side fully grasped how wide it had grown. Japan's carrier pilot corps had never fully recovered from the catastrophic losses of experienced aviators at Midway 2 years earlier, and the losses had only compounded since, through the brutal, months-long air battles over the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, engagements that had quietly ground down exactly the kind of veteran aviators Japan could least afford to lose. Each dead veteran pilot was replaced not by another veteran, but by a barely trained newcomer, with a fraction of the flight hours his predecessors had logged before ever seeing combat. Some new Japanese carrier pilots by early 1944 were being sent into combat with only a small fraction of the flight hours, considered minimally safe before the war began. Meanwhile, American Hellcat squadrons were filled with pilots who had trained for months longer than their Japanese counterparts, flying an aircraft engineered from the ground up to beat the very airplane they were about to face, backed by a logistics and fuel system that never forced their training schedules to be cut short. One American test pilot who flew the recovered Zero against a Wildcat in mock combat over San Diego later described the experience almost as a revelation. He knew intellectually, from months of combat reports, that the Zero could outturn anything the Navy had in the air, flying against it directly, watching from the cockpit of his own aircraft as the Zero rolled inside his turn radius as though his Wildcat were standing still, made the abstraction suddenly, viscerally real. It also showed him exactly where the limit sat. Pushed into a fast, sustained dive, the same Zero that had just outturned him with ease became sluggish and heavy on the controls, its ailerons stiffening at high speed in a way his own aircrafts did not. That single contrast, tested and confirmed methodically rather than guessed at under the stress of combat, became the foundation of nearly every fighter tactics manual the Navy issued for the rest of the war. When the two air forces met in overwhelming numbers on June 19, 1944, near the Mariana Islands, the mismatch became apparent within the first hour. Japanese strike groups, launched from carriers in 4 separate waves throughout the day, flew directly into American radar coverage that gave Hellcat squadrons ample warning and altitude advantage before the Japanese aircraft ever arrived. Zenji Abe, flying in one of the later waves, later described in post-war interviews the disorienting experience of climbing toward what he expected to be a defensible altitude, only to find Hellcats already positioned above him, diving down with speed his own aircraft could not match, and firepower his airframe could not absorb. Japanese pilots who survived the battle consistently described the same bewildering pattern in their after-action accounts. American fighters that refused to turn and dogfight the way Zero pilots had been trained for years to expect, instead diving through Japanese formations at high speed, firing devastating bursts, and climbing away before a Zero could bring its own guns to bear. One surviving pilot's account, recorded after the war, described watching squadron mate after squadron mate attempt the same turning maneuvers that had won battles 2 years earlier, maneuvers that had once forced American wildcats into fatal mistakes, only to find the new American fighters simply were not playing that game anymore. The tactic that had defined Japanese aerial supremacy for the first half of the war had, without a single design change to the Zero itself, become almost obsolete against an opponent who had studied its every weakness in a San Diego test hangar 2 years earlier. Compounding the tactical mismatch was simple inexperience. Many of the Japanese pilots launched that day had only a fraction of the flight training hours their American counterparts carried, some with barely enough experience to safely operate their aircraft in formation, let alone survive a coordinated fighter engagement against veteran opposition. Post-war Japanese naval accounts describe entire strike groups arriving over the American fleet already disorganized, having lost formation cohesion during the approach, making them still easier targets for the waiting Hellcat squadrons. Some Japanese formations, according to accounts collected after the war, broke apart under the sheer disorientation of an American radar-directed intercept they never saw coming until Hellcats were already diving on them from above and behind. Exactly the position Japanese pilots had once used to devastating effect against American aircraft in the early years of the war. On the American side, that same afternoon produced one of the most lopsided individual performances of the entire air war. Commander David McCampbell, leading a division of Hellcats from the carrier Essex, found himself, almost by accident of timing, positioned above a large formation of incoming Japanese aircraft with several of his own squadron mates temporarily out of position. Rather than wait for support, McCampbell and his wingman attacked the formation repeatedly, diving through it again and again in the exact energy tactic pattern the Aleutian Zero tests had validated 2 years earlier, breaking up the Japanese formation before it ever reached the American fleet. McCampbell was credited with several kills that single afternoon alone, on his way to becoming the top-scoring American ace of the entire Second World War, a career built almost entirely on the doctrine of never turning with a Zero and never giving an opponent flying an obsolete aircraft the fight he was trained to expect. American pilots that day described, almost with a note of surprise in their own after-action reports, how comparatively easy many of their kills came, a stark contrast to the desperate, closely fought engagements American aviators had reported flying against Zero pilots in the early years of the war. There is a smaller, quieter detail from that day that captures the scale of the mismatch better than any casualty count. American radar operators aboard the picket destroyers stationed ahead of the main fleet could track the incoming Japanese formations from well over 100 miles out, giving fighter direction officers aboard the carriers ample time to plot intercept courses and vector Hellcat squadrons to precisely the right altitude and position before the Japanese aircraft ever came within visual range of the fleet. Japanese strike leaders, by contrast, had no comparable radar picture of their own, and in several recorded cases did not know American fighters were anywhere near them until Hellcats were already diving out of the sun. A battle that, on paper, involved carriers, fighters, and pilots on both sides had in practice become something closer to an ambush repeated 4 separate times over the course of a single day, decided as much by which side could see the other coming as by anything that happened once the guns started firing. By the time the fighting on June 19th ended, American carrier task forces had shot down an overwhelming majority of the Japanese aircraft launched against them that day, for a strikingly small number of American losses, most of those from operational accidents rather than enemy fire. The battle unfolded across 4 separate Japanese strikes launched throughout the day, each one detected well in advance by American radar picket ships and met by Hellcat squadrons already climbing to altitude before the Japanese aircraft came within visual range. Pilots who flew multiple intercepts that day described a strange, almost assembly line quality to the fighting by the afternoon waves. Engagement after engagement, following the same pattern of American fighters diving from advantageous altitude onto Japanese formations that had little opportunity to organize an effective defense. American radio operators aboard the ships below, listening to the one-sided radio chatter of their own pilots, as Hellcat Squadron after Hellcat Squadron reported easy kills with almost the same enthusiasm as a hunting trip, coined the phrase that would follow the battle into every history book written afterward: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was not a phrase Japanese survivors of that day would ever have chosen, but it captured, with brutal accuracy, exactly how lopsided the fighting had become. Submarines operating in support of the American fleet added to the day's toll before the air battle had even reached its peak, torpedoing 2 of Japan's larger carriers, though the bulk of Japan's losses that day came from the air battle itself rather than from the underwater fighting. The following day, June 20th, American search aircraft finally located the retreating Japanese fleet at the very edge of strike range, late in the afternoon, and with barely enough daylight remaining to launch, recover, and return before darkness made carrier landings dangerous. American commanders made the difficult decision to launch anyway, sending strike aircraft out at extreme range against a fleet that was already withdrawing. The strike found and damaged additional Japanese ships, sinking a 3rd carrier, but returning American aircraft, many of them critically low on fuel in the gathering dark, faced a landing ordeal of their own. In one of the more famous command decisions of the Pacific War, Admiral Mark Mitchell ordered every ship in the task force to turn on its lights, a serious tactical risk that exposed the fleet to potential submarine attack, purely to give his returning aviators a fighting chance of finding their carriers in the dark. Even with the lights, a number of aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched in the water short of their carriers. Their crews recovered over the following hours by escorting destroyers. Pilots who ditched that night in the dark water described the strange relief of finally seeing the glow of the fleet's deck lights on the horizon after what felt like an endless, fuel-starved flight back from extreme range, even for those who ultimately had to put their aircraft down in the water short of the carriers, rather than risk a landing with empty tanks. Destroyer crews spent much of that night and the following morning combing the search area, pulling exhausted aviators from life rafts and from the water itself, and while a number of aircraft were lost that night to fuel exhaustion rather than enemy fire, the overwhelming majority of the pilots themselves were recovered alive. A search and rescue effort, Mitchell's decision to light up the fleet, made possible at real tactical risk to the ships involved. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea finally ended, Japan had lost the overwhelming majority of its carrier-based aircraft, and, far more damaging in the long run, hundreds of pilots that could not simply be replaced by building more airplanes. Japan still had shipyards capable of building more Zeros. It no longer had the trained aviators, the fuel supply, or the time needed to rebuild a pilot corps capable of flying them effectively. It is worth pausing on the industrial side of this story too, because it explains as much about the outcome as anything that happened in the cockpit. Grumman's factory in Bethpage, New York, built more than 12,000 Hellcats in just over 2 years of production, an output pace that would have been unimaginable to Japanese aircraft manufacturers working under wartime material shortages, dispersed and increasingly bombed production facilities, and a shrinking supply of skilled labor as the war dragged on. Where a damaged or shot-down Hellcat pilot could reasonably expect a replacement aircraft, freshly built and fully equipped, waiting for him within weeks, Japanese squadrons by 1944 were frequently cannibalizing damaged airframes for spare parts, just to keep a handful of Zeros flyable. The mismatch in the air over the Marianas did not begin the morning of June 19th. It had been building for 2 years, one factory shift and one flight training class at a time, on opposite sides of the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively ended Japan's ability to fight the United States Navy as a peer carrier force for the remainder of the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy would still field aircraft carriers in the months that followed, most notably months later at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but those carriers sailed largely as decoys, stripped of the trained air groups needed to make them a genuine offensive threat, a hollow shell of the force that had once launched the Pearl Harbor strike. It is one of the more remarkable strategic ironies of the Pacific War that the Zero itself, as an airframe, remained in production and in frontline service until the war's final day. The aircraft had not become obsolete because of any flaw the Japanese Navy failed to notice. It had become obsolete because the men trained to fly it to its full potential were gone, and the pilots who replaced them, however brave, simply did not have the years of accumulated skill needed to exploit an airplane built entirely around the assumption of an elite pilot in the cockpit. The contrast between the two training systems, more than any single piece of engineering, is what historians now point to as the deeper cause of the Marianas Turkey Shoot's lopsided result. A Zero flown by a 1941 veteran with over 1,000 hours in the cockpit, and a Zero flown by a rushed 1944 replacement pilot with a fraction of that experience, were, for all practical purposes, two entirely different weapons, even though the airframe itself had barely changed. The Hellcat, by contrast, was flown almost uniformly by pilots trained under a system that had only grown more thorough and better resourced as the war went on, arriving in the fleet with more flight hours, more gunnery practice, and more confidence in both their aircraft and their tactics than at any earlier point in the Pacific War. Zenji Abe survived the war, one of a shrinking number of veteran Japanese naval aviators who had flown from Pearl Harbor through to nearly the war's end, and in later decades became one of the more thoughtful voices reflecting publicly on what had gone wrong for Japanese naval aviation in those final years, describing not bitterness toward the American pilots who had beaten him, but a clear-eyed recognition that Japan's training pipeline and the industrial fuel supply behind it had simply been outmatched long before the Marianas Turkey Shoot ever began. For the American Navy, the F6F Hellcat would go on to be credited with more aerial victories than any other American fighter of the Second World War, a direct and measurable legacy of a repaired, upside-down wreck pulled out of the Aleutian mud 2 years earlier, tested patiently in a hangar in San Diego, and built into the design of the airplane that ended the Zero's reign in the skies over the Pacific. There is a broader lesson in the story of the Hellcat and the Zero that goes beyond any single afternoon over the Philippine Sea, and it has less to do with airplanes than with the two very different systems that produced the men flying them. Japan's pre-war pilot training program was, by any honest measure, superb, arguably the best in the world in 1941. But it was built to produce a small number of exceptional aviators over a period of years, with almost no capacity to expand quickly or absorb heavy losses. It was a system optimized for a short war. American training, by contrast, started from a position of relative weakness in 1941, and was deliberately built, almost from the outset, around the assumption that the war would be long, that losses would be heavy, and that the pipeline needed to replace pilots faster than Japan could kill them. By the summer of 1944, that difference in institutional design mattered more than any single feature of either airplane. The Zero's designers had built a superb aircraft for the pilots Japan had in 1941. They had no answer for what happened when those pilots were gone. If you want to understand how one recovered wreck, a handful of engineers, and a training pipeline built for the long war Yamamoto always feared turned the most dominant fighter aircraft of the early Pacific War into a liability for the pilots still flying it, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.